All right, we're ready for the book of Job, chapters 27 to 30. In our study tonight, this outline reflects where we are. We're at the end of the third cycle. In fact, we're starting in the last chapter of that cycle. This third cycle started in 22. We're going to review that cycle. And that's the end of the cycles of speeches. And so the friends are through speaking, through at this point. And we'll talk more about whether they are speaking in these chapters or not. There is some question as to whether these are Job's words or could Zophar be involved in some of the speech. We'll say something about that in a moment. So what we're covering tonight involves the third cycle, and then there will be an interlude in chapter 27, and then there's Job's final declaration that starts in chapter 29 and goes through 31. He makes three major points in that final declaration. So basically, Job is doing all the speaking tonight, unless you take the view that part of chapter 27 is a speech by Zophar. We'll see. We'll talk about that here in just a second. So let's review how this cycle started. Job started this cycle in chapter 22, and Eliphaz did. And basically he said, Job, you sinned and you think God doesn't see that. That was basically what he said in his speech. So Job responded to that saying that God is not near and the wicked are not punished now. He comes back to one of the major points he's been making all through his speeches, is that if this is true, that the wicked are not all punished now, they're wicked who prosper, then away with his friend's arguments. And then in chapter 25, Bildad, who was somewhat of a hard hitter, said God is great and man is insignificant. And he really doesn't hit directly to Job so much. It seems to be a response to about God is not accessible. Seemed to be what he's saying. Job in chapter 26 says, you're no help, but God can be help. And so the speeches basically have ended, and we pointed out, and I put this between chapters 26 and 27, this is when it's time for Zophar to speak, and they're going in turn. So as the cycles of speech goes, Job had made his statement in chapter 3, but starting in chapter 4, there's Eliphaz, then Job, Bildad, then Job, Zophar, then Job. You go back through the same cycle, and now it's Zophar's turn. Zophar is silent. Some think he wasn't. And we'll say more about that beginning at verse 7 of chapter 6, or chapter 27. But Zophar was silent. So moreover, Job continued. And this is chapter 27 now. So let's go to our questions now for tonight. Let's go to question number 1. Summarize Job's speech in chapter 27. What do you say? All right. I'm going to hold to my integrity, and those that are against me are like the wicked. So he talks about two things. I'm going to hold to my integrity, and the wicked are hopeless. Whether he's talking about his friends depends on your interpretation beginning at verse 7. That is a controversial section, 7 to 23. We'll get to that here in just a second. So let's talk about verses 1 to 6, and then when we get to verse 7, we'll shift gears a little bit and talk about some of the controversy over chapter 27. So let's talk about him holding to his integrity. The wording of chapter 27 and verse 1 suggests, moreover, Job continued his discourse, suggests that our assumption, let me rephrase it, our understanding, and I'm not sure it's an assumption, that Zophar was silent, that he was silent. It was his turn to speak and he didn't speak. So moreover, Job continued. Zophar hadn't said a thing. Nothing is attributed to Zophar. Now let me get ahead of myself and talk about verses 7 to 23 briefly, and we're going to come back and say more about that later. Some think verses 7 to 23 of chapter 27 is Zophar's speech. And that the heading of where it says Zophar spoke fell out somehow in copies, and consequently it's missing. But there's no manuscript evidence of that. It's not like it appears in one manuscript, but it's missing from another. So there's no manuscript evidence of that. There's no evidence, period, of that. It's just an assumption that verses 7 to 23 was Zophar's speech, and he did speak. And it's misplaced. It kind of fell out of place, and when we put it back in, it was put in the wrong spot. No evidence of that kind of thing. But let's see what he says in verses 1 to 6, and then we'll get back to that question. His point here is, I'm going to hold on to my integrity. And his basic summary of verses 1 to 6 has to be that I'm still maintaining my innocence. I'm not going to give up my faith in God. I hold on to my faith in God. I feel like God set me up for target practice, etc., but I'm still holding on to that. So let's see what he says. As God lives, that seems to be a form of the Hebrew oath, that expression, as well as perhaps verse 5, far be it from me, that it seems to be a form of some Hebrew oath that invokes a curse if what I'm saying is untrue. And it's tantamount to raising his right hand saying that I affirm, and may God curse me if this is not true. But be that as it may, I'll leave that for you to decide and search that out. That as God lives, who has taken away my justice. Now, keep that in mind because we're going to talk about the significance of that justice being taken away. And the Almighty has made my soul bitter. As long as my breath is in me and the breath is in my nostrils, my lips will not speak wickedness, nor my tongue utter deceit. What's he saying? Till I die, I will not put my integrity away. Go ahead. All right. I'm not lying to you. I'm telling you the truth. I am innocent. I'm going to maintain my integrity. I'm going to maintain my purity. As long as I live, I promise you, I've not done anything like you've claimed that I have done. Verse 6, my righteousness I hold fast and will not let it go. I'm holding on to the claim that I am righteous. Job is not claiming I'm righteous by my own deeds. He's not saying I'm righteous and I don't need God. What he's saying is I'm doing what's right. And I've lived right and I have not done what you claim. My heart shall not reproach me as long as I live. In other words, I've made my intention to live right. I've lived right and I'm not lying to you. And so I'm holding on to my integrity. All right. That being said, we start at verse 7 through verse 23, and I've worded it here as the hopeless condition of the wicked. Now let's get ahead of ourselves before we look at that and raise the question that scholars have raised, who's speaking here? On a cursory reading of that, we think it's Job, and I still think that's the case. There is no indication that it's not Job. Some think that it's Zophar. So let's talk about this controversy, about verses 7 to 20. The controversy is because this section of Job's speech, let's just take verses 7 to 20, lift it out and read that. And so if it'd been a while since you'd looked at the book of Job and I handed you just printed out without saying who it is, verses 7 to 20, didn't give you the reference, and I said, who does this sound like? You would say, that sounds like Eliphaz. That sounds like Bildad. Maybe not quite as hard-hitting as Zophar, but it does sound like Eliphaz, Bildad, or Zophar, and it does. And that's part of the controversy. Some suggest this is Zophar's speech, and I've already mentioned that it's missing. Several commentators mentioned that this may be Zophar's speech that was missing, and he didn't remain silent, and it just kind of got shoved off and misplaced. And so it's out of order here. Or maybe Job started speaking, and then he decided, well, I do need to speak. It's possible that Job's inconsistent. That's another possibility, that Job in his state of mind and his frustration, that he says one thing and then he says almost the exact opposite. That happens sometimes. And so maybe Job is inconsistent. I'll grant that's possible, probably more probable than the first. Another possibility is that Job is stating his friend's view without reply. In other words, this is what you say. But he's not responding to that because he's already responded. So that's possible. We do that in sermons sometimes. I might be preaching on whether or not baptism is essential, and I may make the argument. But since I've already answered that earlier in the sermon, I just may make the argument baptism is not essential because it's not mentioned in Romans 5:1. And just leave it hanging at that because I've already answered that earlier in the sermon. Maybe that's what Job is doing. I don't think so. I think it's more likely that Job is admitting the general truth of what his friends are saying, and yet it denies application to himself. Did Job generally agree all through the book thus far? Let's stop before we get to chapter 27. Has Job agreed with his friends in principle? that God is righteous and God punishes the wicked. Yes, he agrees with that. What he disagrees with is that God always punishes in this life the wicked, that sometimes the wicked prosper. Remember, he made that argument in two speeches. Francis Anderson made this observation that I think is worthy of taking note. He said, since Job nowhere denies the justice of God, it is not inconsistent for him to affirm it here. The disagreement between Job and his friends is not over whether God is just or not. It's over the justice of God, of how the justice of God is seen to work out in particular events and specifically in Job's experience. And I think Francis Anderson is exactly right. That what he's saying, God is just and God does punish the wicked. And Job acknowledges that. But where Job disagrees is, does that fit in every circumstance that when this one is suffering, that means therefore he's wicked? That's where he disagreed with him, and he's already made that point. Haley observes this in his commentary. He says Job believed that he was a victim of injustice. I flagged that as we came by verse 2. Thus verses 13 to 23 is not so much about the destiny of the wicked as it is a declaration of his innocence. And any who falsely accuse him should suffer as the wicked. So perhaps based on that, if we assume this is Job, that Job is targeting his friends, saying, if you are unjustly charging me, you're in the class of those who are wicked. Does that make sense? And that would seem to harmonize with this, that here's a general truth. I agree with that. It just doesn't apply to me, but it might apply to you because you're unjustly charging me. Does that make sense? Now, you do with it what you wish. You say, I think it's Zophar's speech. Have at it. I don't think you have any evidence of that. You think Job's just inconsistent. Well, I think we could establish that at times. I think more the encircled section here makes sense to me. Questions or comments on that? All right. Assuming it's Job's speech, and I think it is, because there's no evidence otherwise, let's start at verse 13 and talk about the hopeless condition of the wicked. Verses 7 through 12, I think his point is, my enemies are like the wicked. He compares them to being wicked. Does that mean he's comparing his friends to being wicked? Well, it seems like it. Let's see. Look at verse 7. May my enemy be like the wicked. Well, who would be his enemy? It's, at this point, his friends. Did Job have other enemies? Well, he talks about how the young, a little bit later, he's going to talk about how the young showed disdain for him and kicked at his feet and etc. So they would be his enemies, obviously, but he doesn't name them. But at this point, no one's any harder on him than his friends. No one is more unjust to him than his friends, I would think. And there is some conjecture that he's talking about his friends. May my enemy be like the wicked, and he who raises up against me like the unrighteous. For what hope has the hypocrite? Now, it's interesting. If he's talking about his friends, he seems to be turning the charge of hypocrisy back on his friends, doesn't he? What hope has the hypocrite, though he gain much if God takes away his life? God will hear his cry when trouble comes, and he will delight himself will he delight himself in the Almighty when he calls upon God? He said, I will teach you about the hand of God. Some commentators made the observation his friends have now become silent, so he's going to take the role of the instructor. I will teach you about the hand of God. What is with the Almighty I will not conceal. And surely all of you have seen it. Why then do you behave with the complete nonsense? So I think the tone of verses 7 to 12 is targeting his friends and comparing them to enemies. Questions, comments, disagreements? In other words, you're full of nothing but nonsense in your charges against me, and you're nothing more than like the wicked. Now then, beginning at verse 13, this is the section 13 to 23 that sounds like his friends. So he talks about the consequences of wickedness. First of all, he basically says three things. They're cut off. We won't read every word of this. That the portion of the wicked, this is the portion of a wicked man with God, and the heritage of his oppressors. If his children are multiplied, it's for the sword, and if his offspring shall not be satisfied with bread, those who survive shall be buried in death. I'm going to come back to the widows at verse 15. Let's stop there at verse 15. What did you see at verses 13 to 15? What happens to the wicked? Job acknowledges this does happen to wicked people at times. That God eventually cuts them off. Job doesn't talk about, Job does not mention here that he thinks that all wicked are punished in this life, like his friends seem to argue. He just said the wicked are cut off. Now notice at verse 15, and their widows shall not weep. Anderson observes that perhaps means their widows. He argues that the wicked are polygamist here. I don't know that that's the case. If he's not more talking about wicked plural, have widows plural, meaning, but I'll leave that for you to decide. But he does mention here at verse 15, their wicked shall not weep. It means there's good riddance. They're so wicked that finally when they die, it's kind of good riddance. The widows don't even weep. Have nothing to weep for because they're glad they're gone. So the wicked are cut off. That's what Job acknowledges. The second thing he mentions about the wicked, verses 16 to 18, is what? Yeah, the riches are left behind. They heap up silver like dust, and they pile up clothing like clay. And they pile it up, but the just will wear it, and the innocent will divide the silver. And he builds houses like a moth and like a booth in which your watchman makes. What he's saying is that they heap up riches and then they left it to someone else. Well, this is what happens to the wicked. The wicked heap up riches and they pass it on to somebody else. In other words, he's just pointing to the fact that there's a hopeless condition. They're cut off and they leave the riches for others. Then verses 19 to 23, now Job's going to tap into this principle that he's about to mention and launch into it after his interlude and talk about it in chapter 29. That the wicked are taken away and they're mocked. The rich man will lie down, but not be gathered up. He opens his eyes and he is no more. Terrors overtake him like a flood. Some think Job's talking about himself here. I don't know that he's describing himself. That when I talk about him being mocked, look at the end of verse 23, or the end of that section, verse 23. Men shall clap their hands at him and shall hiss him out of his place. What does that suggest to you? Yeah, they delight in his downfall. They clap their hands and they ridicule and mock him. And so that happens to those who are wicked. The righteous can be glad indeed that he's gone and out of the way. Verse 21 mentions the east wind carries him and he's gone. So is this Job being inconsistent? Let's go back to this principle, but now come back to that outline in a moment. Having read that now, if you hadn't read that before class, after reading that section, 13 to 23, this point here, these 3 points, that the wicked are cut off, the riches will be turned over to another, he's taken away and he's mocked. Is that Job speaking or is that Zophar? I don't think that's Zophar. There's no indication that it's Zophar. Is that Job being inconsistent? Maybe. Maybe he's arguing the way of the friends and then turns around and inconsistently denies it. I think it makes more sense that Job is acknowledging a general principle. There's consequences to wickedness, but you're wrong in your application to me. Is it true that you reap what you sow? Yes, I would agree with that. Were they true in their application to Job? No, they were wrong. So we can agree with them in principle without agreeing with their application of that. If so, we could all agree with the principle. If I got up Sunday and preached to you, reap what you sow, everybody would agree because you can read it in the text. But what if I said if you have an accident in the next 3 months of any sort, you fall down, you hit your head, do anything, that means you're a wicked person. Would you agree with that? No, because that's a misapplication of the principle. That's what Job's doing here, agreeing with the principle, but not the application. Make sense? All right, that's Job's speech. Now, let's go to this interlude. Verse 1 of chapter 28 now. Let's go to questions before I say much more. Question number 2. chapter 28 is Job's great interlude on wisdom. What is his point? And what does he say about wisdom? Say again.
Wisdom is something that has to be searched for and sought out.
Yes, wisdom has to be searched for and sought out. What else? Yeah, true wisdom comes from God. How does man become wise? He tells us. By fearing God. Yes, that's where true wisdom comes. And that's what Job's been claiming throughout the chapter. Not so much claiming I'm wise, he's claiming I fear God. And he's saying that's the source, that's where you get true wisdom. All right, let's see what we have here in this chapter. This is an interlude on wisdom. Some think that there is a question as to who wrote this chapter now. Remember we talked about, there's a question about part of chapter 7. And the question here is, was this written by Job? Is this a speech by Job? Or is this by whoever authored the book? Some think it's Moses, some think it was Job. I think there's evidence it probably was not Job, maybe, I'm not sure. But be that as it may, if it's Moses, let's just say that for illustration, that this was inserted by the author of the book as a declaration of wisdom. If so, we've not told about that at all. This seems to be just a continuation of chapter 27, and that it is this great declaration on wisdom. But he stops and just makes some points about wisdom before he comes back to talk about himself. And so we call this an interlude. It may not be, but I take it to be an interlude on wisdom. And I think it's Job speaking. So let's see what he says. Three things. He first of all raises the question, where can wisdom be found? And so what does he say in verses 1 through 11? Yes. Yeah, man searches for wisdom, but we cannot search and find it like a treasure. And so he gives some illustrations that we can mine for silver and for gold and for iron and for copper. And he talks about some of the details of doing that. A man puts an end to darkness. In other words, he goes down into the mine and searches in every recess. And he breaks open a shaft and places forgotten by feet, places where men have never walked. And he talks about suspending himself from the ceiling of the mines in verse 4. Underneath the earth, he said, we find stones like sapphire. This is a place where birds never gone, and where the lions have never trotted. Man cuts out channels in the rocks, and he finds all kinds of precious things. He dams up the stream from the trickles, and what is hidden he finds to light. One way of finding gold. So man searches for that like treasure. Let's skip verse 12 and 13, go to verse 14. The deep says it's not in me. So you go to those places and you can find all kinds of precious possessions, but you don't find wisdom there. So the deep says what? Not in me. And the sea says, it's not in me. So man could go searching like he does for gold and copper, etc., and he doesn't find it. Now, let's drop down to the bottom of our slide here. There's key verses to this section. You might mark verse 12 and verse 20. Verse 12, what's the point? Yeah, where can you find wisdom and where's the place of understanding? So we can't find it where you find gold, silver, and sapphire. We can't find it there. Look at verse 20. For where then does wisdom come and where's the place of understanding? That's the point of the chapter. Where can wisdom be found? All right, now let's talk about verses 15. We skip verse 13. We'll come back to that. Let's talk about verses 15 to 19. What does he say there? You can't buy wisdom. You can't go to the marketplace and say, I want a box of wisdom. Give me a pallet of wisdom. You can't do that. Cannot be purchased for gold, nor can silver be weighed for its price. It can be valued in the gold of Ophir, nor can gold or crystals equal it. In other words, you can't find it anywhere. And consequently, you can't go buy it anywhere. So it's not something that can be purchased with a great sum. That cannot be done. Now, beginning at verse 13, not found in man or in creation. Let's go back to get verse 13. We skipped that on purpose. Man does not know its equal, nor is it found in the land of the living. In other words, you don't go just to some man and say, you're the one with wisdom, give all the wisdom to me. Sell it to me. Can't do that. Now starting at verse 21 and 22, what do you see in 21 and 22? It's hidden from the eyes of the living. In other words, it's not found in man. And death and Hades said what about it? We've heard about it, but it's not here. So you got to go looking somewhere else for it. So that's driving to this point. His whole point is driving at verses 23 to 27. What's his point in 23 to 27? Yeah, God knows. God understands its way and God knows its place. For he looks to the end of the earth and sees under the whole heavens and to establish a weight in the wind and meets out the measure of waters by measure. He made a law for the rain. In other words, the same God that created the world and set all of the laws of nature in motion is the one who holds the key and the path for wisdom. He made a law for the rain and a path for the thunderbolt, etc. And then verse 27 to finish that section, he saw wisdom, declared it, and he prepared it indeed. He searched it out. God has the monopoly on wisdom. Now then, what's verse 28 say about wisdom? All right, what is it? The fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. To depart from evil is understanding. What's that mean? Right. It wasn't through his own source. Good point. Good point.
Also saying that you sat here and y'all talked to me and you've given me all your thoughts, but I'm fearing God. I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. I may still be suffering, but I don't have the wisdom to understand why, but I'm still going to fear God.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm going to trust in God, and I'm going to leave it to God to know all the details and figure it all out. I'm not going to figure it out. Job doesn't figure it out to our knowledge. He never figures it all out, what's going on in his life. So man becomes wise by fearing God, and that's Job's claim. I've been trying to fear God. I've done that. I'm not going to give up my integrity. I'm going to hold on for dear life. Make sense? All right, let's raise the question, what's the point of chapter 28? And he's saying wisdom is with God and wisdom is not with man. His friends don't hold a monopoly on wisdom, and God knows what's going on whether we do or not. Would you agree with that? So Job stops and gives this grand speech about wisdom, kind of an interlude, and you say, okay, what was that all about? I thought he's been talking about he's holding to his integrity and I'm innocent, and then he turns around and talks about the wisdom of God. It seems to be driving at this, that wisdom is with God. It's not with you, fellas. Y'all don't hold a monopoly on wisdom. You think you do, but you don't hold a monopoly on wisdom. God knows what's going on, whether you do or not. And to fear God is the source of true wisdom. Make sense? All right, let's go to chapter 29 now. Chapters 29 to 31. Question number 3 is Job's final declaration. The note about a booklet is from a previous class where we handed out a booklet, so ignore that. So the first part of the question is, how does he describe his former happiness in chapter 29? All right, in former times he had prospered. What else?
Took care of others. He was someone who was always in the gates. So he had authority.
All right, respected in the gates. Very good. In this speech, this goes from chapter 29, 30, and 31. We're only going to cover 29 and 30, so we'll get 31 next time. 31 is a grand chapter. Not that to minimize 29 and 30, but you want to remember chapter 31. I think parallel in principle to Proverbs 31. So just look at that, think of that when you get ready for class next time. But be that as it may, he talks about his former happiness, his present humility, and his challenge of innocence here. So this is Job's final speech. And some think that this is kind of a bookend. Chapter 3 and chapters 29 to 31, and particularly 31, is bookends to this whole discussion about Job. Job is lamenting his day of death, but then he day of his birth, and then he gives this final declaration. Let's talk about his former happiness. Job basically says, this is the way it used to be with me. So let's see what he says. In verses 1 to 6, God watched over me and blessed me. Verse 2, I think, would be and verse 6 would be keys to that section. Oh, that I were in months past, in the days when God watched over me. Well, one of the implications of seeing that is this problem has lasted for months. I wished I was in months past, not days past or hours past. This has gone on for months. So Job's problems, we saw a reference to Job's friends sitting for 7 days, but this cycle of discussion has gone on for months. This problem has gone on for months. He suffered for months. But I wished I was in months past when God watched over me. When my steps were bathed with cream, I'm reading at verse 6, and the rock poured rivers of oil out from me. I was just so blessed. It's like I was, we use an expression today, sitting in a tub of butter. I wished I was just bathed with cream like it was in days and months past. That's how it used to be. All right, what does he say in 7 through 10? Yeah, I went to the gate of the city. I took my seat in the open square. Young men saw me and they hid, and aged rose and stood. There was a time I went into the open square and aged men stood out of respect for me. And the voice of the nobles hushed and their tongue stuck to the roof of their mouth. When the ear heard, then it blessed me. In other words, they listened to me. They stayed quiet so they could listen to my words. I was highly respected. And I wished I was back in those days when I was highly respected in verses 7 through 10. Let's drop down now to 21 to 25. Similar thoughts. Men listened to me and they waited. They kept silence at my counsel. After my word, they did not speak again. In other words, they didn't rebut me. They listened to me and they listened to the wisdom that I offered to them. And I was well respected. I wished I was back in those days. I was well blessed. I was well respected. 11 to 17. I wished I lived in the days when I could. He helped other people. Yeah. I wished I was living in the day and in the months. I delivered the poor who cried out and the fatherless who had no helper. And I was a blessing to a perishing man. I put on righteousness and it clothed me. In other words, that's interesting that he's like clothing himself with righteousness, an Old Testament principle mentioned numerous times. Verse 17, I broke the fangs of the wicked and plucked the victim from his teeth. When I saw someone being mistreated, I rescued them. I helped those that were in need. I wished it was in months past when I did that. We're not there anymore. Then finally, verses 18 to 20, what did he say? Yeah, I said, I shall die in my nest and multiply my days as the sand. I thought I'd live a long time. And remember, this whole discussion started in chapter 3 where he wished he could just die. He don't want to live any longer. And wished he'd died at birth and never been born, and then he wished he'd died at birth and he wished he could die now. And that's what started his friends out, rebuking him, you remember. Yes, ma'am.
This very much sounds like he's given his own eulogy.
Yeah, it does. It does. All right, any questions on his 29, his former happiness? This is the way it used to be. And he's going to draw a contrast to chapter 30. Now, don't lose sight of where we're going with this. There are three major points. Chapter 29, my former happiness, my present humility, but then in chapter 31, he closes by maintaining his innocence. Now, his friends got specific toward the end of their discussion. Well, you're guilty of this and you're guilty of that. And that was all assumption. Job gets real specific. He talks about what he didn't do. I didn't do this, and I didn't do that, and I didn't do this, and I didn't do that, and I didn't do that. That's in chapter 31. All right, let's go to chapter 30. So back to our question number 3, part B. How does he describe his present humility?
Basically, his status and reputation has changed amongst others.
All right. His reputation has changed. What else? Say again. Yes, he's miserable with his disease. Which brings me to question number 5. What do you learn about Job's disease from chapter 30? Yeah, it is absolutely terrible. We'll try to flag these as we come across these. His bones pierced him. Some suggest that he's lost so much weight that his bones are sticking out. Have you ever seen someone who has a disease and they lose so much weight that you see the skeleton basically? All right. He's in pain. He's disfigured. Skin is black. It's peeling. He has fever. I learned all that from chapter 30. So we didn't learn all about his health problems early on in the book. We're learning some of that here. So let's work our way through chapter 30. Now, he starts off in 1 to 15 saying he's mocked by the young and the vile of society. And so he says in verses 1 to 8, here's some of their characteristics, verses 1 to 8. There are 3 things I want you to see here. So I'll just list these in interest of time. Number 1, verse 1 suggests they're vile. So I'm mocked by those who are vile. But now they mock at me among men younger than I, whose fathers I disdain to put with the dogs of my flock. I mean, children of men that were so wicked and corrupt that I wouldn't have trusted them to put them among my flocks. Those young men mock at me and they ridicule me. Men used to stand and listen to me. Men of age used to stand and listen to me, and now I'm mocked by the youth. They ridicule me, mock me. They're vile, number 1. Number 2, verse 4 suggests they're scavengers, that they pluck the mallow of the bush by the bush, and they are driven from among men. They live in the clefts of the rocks, etc. And they're outcast, verses 5 through 8. They're outcast. So he's saying here are vile scavengers who have been cast out from among men and worthless to even live among others. That's the kind of people that look at me with disdain. I'm disdained, and they were scourged from the land, and they're the ones who have held me in disdain, and they have mocked at me, verses 1 to 8. Now, verses 9 to 15, what does he say? Here's how I'm treated. I'm their taunt song. I'm their byword. They don't hesitate to spit in my face. What else? They push away my feet. They rise against me.
It's not bad enough. They want to make it worse.
Yeah.
They promote my calamity.
Here's a guy sitting in ash heaps and they kick at him versus standing in respect of him. And so he said, I'm mistreated in disdain. This is my present humility. You remember what I used to be like? Chapter 29 is quite different now. Now let's look at 16 to 19, the agony of his disease. That my soul is poured out of my plight. My days of affliction have taken hold of me. My bones pierce me in the night. Perhaps he's lost a tremendous amount of weight. My gnawing pains take no rest. That is, there's no relief from what he's suffering. Now, verse 18, your translation may read a little bit different. By great force my garment is disfigured. It binds me about as a collar of my coat. Some translations suggest that he feels like his clothes are just as if you took somebody by the throat. And he feels like he's been taken by the throat, and his garment's choking him in the throat. The Revised English Version says that his garment is splattered with phlegm. And that's what's choking him as a collar. That's interesting. Another one suggests that his garment is spotted with oozing from the sores. Whatever it is, it's being described that his garment is disfigured. That by great force my garment is disfigured. Not that he's disfigured, but my garment is disfigured. Perhaps his garments are stained with, are splattered with phlegm or with oozing from the sores. He has cast me from the mire and he's become like dust and ashes. And so in other words, I'm suffering, like tremendously I'm suffering. Now 20 to 23, what does it say? Verse 20 summarizes that. Yeah, God seems to have turned his back. I cry out to you, but you do not answer me. I stand up and you regard me, but you have become cruel to me. With the strength of your hand, you oppose me. So it seems like he's crying out to God. Some suggest maybe he's talking about his friends. I cried out to you for help. You were no help. But he's mentioned this about God already. So this is not surprising that he would say, I cry out to God and I get no answer. I get no help. Now, verse 24 to 31, let's finish that section, and we're going to be about done. What do you see here? Yeah, basically, have I suffered? Go ahead. Yeah, how could it get much worse? Yeah, I've done good and received evil for it. Notice in verse 25, have I not wept for him who was in trouble? In other words, I had mercy toward others. I was going about mourning, verse 28, but not in the sun. My skin grows black and falls from me. That's another reference to the peeling and the blackening of the skin. And my bones burn with fever. Months later, he still has fever from whatever he's suffering. From the loss of his health, and my harp is turned to mourning and my flute and the voice to those who weep. In other words, I used to rejoice. My flute was played in chapter 29, and now my heart is gone out and I don't have any song anymore. And so I'm suffering. Make sense? Chapter 31, next time, what he's going to do is turn and make a declaration that indeed, I am innocent. And it is a highlight in the book. All right, about a minute to go, so let's, practical things you've learned from this chapters that you take home with you from 27, 29, 30, and 31. What have you seen? Good point. Good point. What else? Take home with you.
We know behind the scenes that God was holding back. It wasn't a address from Satan the way that Satan brought to it. And yet we read these chapters and we see how bad it was. And then we know it could be worse. And in our own lives, we don't see God holding back. We don't know what's going on, but we know that it could be worse. And we don't have to ask him, why me?
Good point. Good point. All right. That's true. Not going to take it with us.
Man knew how to find all these treasures he listed, gold and onyx and sapphire and silver and all. Man knew how to find all those things and worked hard at finding them. But we don't work near as hard at trying to find wisdom.
That's a good point. It's easier to get gold than it is to find wisdom for man generally. One of the things I'm learning from this is the long suffering of God. This has gone on for months, this problem with Job. And the friends have gone on and on and on and misrepresented Job. And Job's lashed out at God, and yet God's waited all this time and hadn't said a word. You think about that. I would have wanted to set the record straight the first time Eliphaz said things wrong. And yet God's just waiting. And God's going to speak, but he's waiting. And that's the long suffering of God. And so there's a very practical thing in that. Chapter 31 next time.